Good afternoon. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Vice President for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you here to this latest in our SRSG series featuring Filippo Grandi, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, known to all of us as UNRWA. SRSG, as you all know, stands for Special Representative of the Secretary General, and we began this series, Name for Them, in 2006. Those of you who know my background as a New York Times foreign correspondent will not be surprised to learn that this is one of the favorite things, my favorite things we do at IPI, because it brings people from posts far from UN headquarters and out there in the trenches, in effect, eyewitness reporters who have real first-hand, on-the-ground experience, and it brings them into contact with headquarters colleagues and the diplomatic and policy community based here in New York. As an old foreign editor, I consider these reports of the SRSG's live dispatches from the front. This year, we've been fortunate to showcase many outstanding SRSGs, or as we do today, their counterparts by slightly different titles. We started in late January in the same part of the world that we returned to today when we had Major General Robert Mood, then the head of mission and chief of staff of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, known as UNTSO, which is actually the UN's original peacekeeping force in the Middle East. In early March, we had Ellen Margareta Loy, the SRSG for Liberia, talk to us about upcoming elections there, and then later that month, former Undersecretary General Ibrahim Gambari came to speak on the challenges he faced in Darfur when he was the SRSG there. In April, Ad Melkert, the SRSG for Iraq, came to talk about the UN mission in his conflicted area. In June, we had two series guests, Roger Meese, the SRSG for the Democratic Republic of the Congo and head of the UN's largest peacekeeping force, MONUSCO, followed by Edmund Moulay, the then and now again Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, who for 16 months acted as the emergency SRSG for Haiti in the aftermath of the devastating earthquake there in January 2010. Our most recent series guest this September was Augustine Mahiga, the SRSG for Somalia, a place so convulsed by war that Ambassador Mahiga must do much of his work from neighboring Kenya. Now, you just heard the countries and the region that I mentioned: the Middle East, Liberia, Sudan, Iraq, the DRC, Haiti, Somalia, all places of staggering challenges, but none of them more so than the ongoing struggle of Palestinian refugees. And that is where today's guest, Filippo Grandi, runs a critical UN organization, UNRWA, which he served as Commissioner General, which he has served as Commissioner General since January 2010, but where for the 5 prior years he was the Deputy Commissioner General. It is the UN agency charged with bringing education, health, relief, and social services to as many as 5 million Palestinian refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. You have his full biography in your papers, but you will note in it that in addition to some of the dangerous places I just mentioned, he has had extensive experience in Afghanistan. He has chosen to give us a very timely report on his activities under the title Palestinian Refugees in the Arab Spring, a Forgotten Constituency. Mr. Grandi, welcome to IPI, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Warren, and good afternoon, everybody. I am honored to come after such a string of illustrious speakers, many of whom actually are my good friends, and to be part of the SRSG series. I'm less special than an SRSG, but my job presents also some challenges, although different from theirs. or complementary, if I should say. I'm very honored also to be speaking here at the International Peace Institute and very grateful for the invitation. I'll just share with you some thoughts, not really a report perhaps, but more some thoughts that I hope can provide the basis for a discussion and for a question on your part. We chose, with the IPI, we chose this title, A Forgotten Constituency, but in particular, we decided that it was timely and interesting to situate this within the context of the so-called Arab Spring, which is really a very defining feature in the region where we operate, given, as you all know very well, the enormous changes that are happening or are being discussed, at least, as possibly happening. As I always say, the Arab Spring has opened up in the region an extraordinary space for people to express their aspirations and their wishes. It's not everywhere that these changes are actually happening. In some places they are, in some other places there's trouble, in some other places there's no real change, but the space is there for everybody. And thanks to the global media and thanks to what people can watch on TV or on internet, and almost everybody can these days, the impact on people's minds more than anything else is quite extraordinary. And I can assure you that living there, having lived there throughout this period, has been a special experience. And I thought it may be interesting to give you one of the many, many perspectives that even here in New York you will have heard about the situation. The perspective of UNRWA, so an agency that is working in the region and has a lot of experience in this region, but more importantly, the perspective of this group of people, the Palestinian refugees, the Palestine refugees as they're technically called, numbering by now almost 5 million. So quite an important constituency in the middle of a very sensitive situation, and certainly a perspective from the ground. The most striking feature that one notices when talking about Palestinian refugees in this time of history is contrast between a very dynamic context and the stagnation of some important processes, especially the peace process, that are of direct concern to the Palestinian refugees, to the Palestinians in general, and to the Palestinian refugees in particular. The stagnation of the peace process, although the statehood discussion has certainly introduced a new element, has an added feature that within the peace process, or what is left of it at the moment, the refugee question seems to be suffering from a particular specific stagnation. There's been a lot of talk lately of putting on the table first, whenever these negotiations hopefully resume, borders, security, and related problems. But the refugee questions, also because of its extreme sensitivity and complexity for both parties, tends to be pushed towards the end of the discussion. And this adds to the frustration of the people that have been waiting for a solution for so long. The refugees are our constituency for UNRWA. Like I said, they number now in excess of 4.5 million in terms of registered refugees, in fact 4.6, 4.7. They number almost 5 million. They all live in different, as you know, they live in different countries. The ones at least that are under our mandate, who are the bulk of the refugees, in Gaza and in the West Bank, but also in Jordan, large numbers, in Syria, in Lebanon. So almost everywhere in situations that are increasingly complex and sensitive. And the situation, the circumstances in which they live are complicated further, if you wish, by the fact that UNRWA, the main provider of services to these communities, which the main provider for more than 6 decades, is struggling with a resource environment that, like for everybody else, is more and more difficult with the economic climate of the world today. In the world today, to go out to capitals, as I do almost all the time, and to ask for money has become very, very difficult in countries where unemployment is growing, where governments are grappling with the political consequences of the economic downturn. To go and ask for funds to pay for the salaries of Palestinian teachers is extremely difficult. In countries where the salaries of their own teachers, of the teachers of those countries, are being reduced or cut, numbers, general public services are under pressure, it has become a real challenge. But this translates, of course, into increasing efforts, painful efforts for UNRWA to maintain the quality and level of services that it is mandated to provide to the refugees, but with some difficulty. And this is, of course, interpreted many times, right or wrong, interpreted by the refugees and many others as a signal that the international community is abandoning the refugees. Hence the title, with a question mark, though, of this event, A Forgotten Constituency. I'll go back to this point in a few minutes. Perhaps a few words, although I guess that most of you are familiar with UNRWA. We are a rather unique entity even within the United Nations system. We are very large, almost 30,000 staff. The overwhelming majority of the staff are teachers, are Palestinian teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers. But we are also very limited geographically. We are the only agency that deals with one specific issue, that of the Palestinian refugees, with one population, in fact, and therefore our mandate has a geographical limitation to the Near East. We work directly with the people that are under our mandate. We don't work through NGOs. We don't work through, although we work often with NGOs, but not through NGOs. We don't work through governments. We work directly. We provide, our staff are our teachers in the classroom, and they, every day, actually, this is what I have always liked about UNRWA, that you feel that every day, whatever happens in the midst of so many difficulties, you provide a service that makes a difference in the lives of so many children and of so many other people. Same thing for the health centers. Just to give you a sense of the size, we have about, at the moment, almost 500,000 children in our schools. This is more than many public services in small countries have. And we directly administer this very large education system. In fact, many times I say that UNRWA is essentially an education agency. It's an agency that practically provides education to the children, to a very large population of children. But of course, we do other things. So we are sometimes defined as a humanitarian agency. I think that, yes, we do humanitarian work when there is conflict, in Gaza, for example, in Lebanon, in various phases of recent history. We have provided humanitarian services like food or like special assistance to people in distress. But our fundamental work is what we call human development work, is really education and health in a regular manner, in a manner like a state would provide to its own population. And increasingly, we are asked to also address the consequences of conflict. This started probably in the last decade, after the conflict in Jenin, but also in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in other places as well. We are engaged in large reconstruction projects that have actually added quite a significant dimension to the work that we do. I don't want to give you a full report of the situation in each country. Let me just address perhaps some of the challenges that the refugees and, as a consequence, UNRWA are facing, or the types of challenges that the refugees are facing, because they are different from place to place. In Gaza and the West Bank, refugees, Palestinian refugees, share by and large the challenges of other Palestinians who are not refugees. Remember, in Gaza, the refugees are about 2/3 of the population, and in the West Bank, it's the reverse. They are about 1/3 of the population. But because of the circumstances in Gaza, of course, our operation there is very big. Many people think that we're only in Gaza, in fact, although we're in many other places. But in Gaza, in many ways, our work is particularly significant because of the large proportion of the population that utilizes our services in health, education, and so forth. I'm often asked the question whether in Gaza there is or there isn't a humanitarian crisis. And my answer invariably has been the same. The crisis, to define the crisis in Gaza as humanitarian is actually not correct and is a very reduced definition, because a humanitarian crisis you can address with food, with medicines, and actually bringing in food and medicines has never been the fundamental problem of the situation in Gaza. As I always say to my Israeli interlocutors, the crisis is much bigger. The blockade that was imposed in Gaza following the takeover by Hamas in 2007 essentially had very negative effects on infrastructure, on public services, on the economy. It also had an even worse effect than previous closures on the freedom of movement of the citizens of Gaza, of the Palestinians in Gaza. And as a consequence of all this, I would say, it had an effect on the psyche of the people. You know, we run, or we have run, because now we have financial problems there, but we have run for many years psychosocial support to citizens of Gaza, to people in Gaza. And we have seen actually a spike, an increasing trend of people demanding our services, including children, because of the pressure of isolation. So this is an additional dimension that should not be forgotten. But of course, the most obvious, the most clear consequences of this situation are a depressed economy, due in large part to the fact that exports are still extremely limited, and a deterioration in services. And everything is affected, you know, the quality of water, electricity, the healthcare in hospitals, and so forth. UNRWA has been able, throughout this crisis, to continue to run its education and health services. We have always been able to import medicines, or almost always been able to import medicines, and we have almost always been able to import cash to pay the salaries of our staff, and that allows the services to continue, although, of course, there have been other problems. But otherwise, reconstruction is what has really, or infrastructure is what has really suffered also from our perspective. Up to 2010, the blockade was very harsh, and it was very difficult to import materials. But in the past year, as I said to the General Assembly, I'm here actually in New York to report to the General Assembly. I briefed the fourth committee of the GA on Monday, and I made it very clear that there have been considerable improvements in our ability to import materials. I mean, our cooperation with the Israeli authorities over the past year has considerably improved for the areas in which we are authorized to bring in building materials and other important items that are needed for improving or building new infrastructure. This is positive. Our problem is that, as I said, publicly and privately to our Israeli interlocutors, and by and large they agree on this, is that we need to make those procedures more agile, more flexible, to be able to accelerate our program. Let's not forget that the blockade has been always a very strange animal, because it has actually fostered and encouraged traffic through illegal tunnels that have supplied in turn an illegal economy, which has been of benefit really to a very small number of people. That's why we always say that the blockade is counterproductive. That's why we've been very public. We sometimes, many Israeli friends that I have agree with that, others don't, but this is to me fairly clear. And of course, one should not forget that also it is illegal from the point of view of international law. Hence our constant call for lifting the blockade, which is the fundamental point. But while waiting for that, which is of course constrained by the extremely difficult situation on the ground, it is important that the easing continues and progresses. Of course, situations as the one we've seen during the past weekend with rockets being fired, with incursions by the Israelis, don't help in our efforts to bring help to the people and actually set the clock back to a considerable extent. In the West Bank, the situation is different, of course. There's been a lot of progress in security, in the economy, thanks largely to the very good work done by Prime Minister Fayyad and his government, and the situation of what we call the closures presents a mixed picture. It is true that some checkpoints have been eliminated, hence granting more movement for the Palestinians, but this has been still the case for a minority of those obstacles. And unfortunately, as I said the other day in the Fourth Committee, we have seen an increase, especially lately, in demolitions of Palestinian houses and in general in other in forms of pressure on Palestinians, due largely to the fact that the settlement expansion, which has continued throughout, is not just a political issue, as it is often seen, but it has practical consequences on the ground for Palestinians, that especially those that live near where those settlements are expanded. We have been particularly concerned with some vulnerable groups in Area C, in other parts of the West Bank. We have advocated very strongly for them, together with the rest of the United Nations system, privately with Israeli authorities, and this, often gives positive results. And sometimes publicly, we are concerned that in the present complicated political circumstances, the increase in this type of what we consider violation of human rights will not help create an environment conducive to good political discussions, and of course have terrible human consequences for the people who are affected. The challenges of rights, which are really the challenges that the Palestinian refugees face in the West Bank, are not limited to the West Bank, are not limited to the occupied Palestinian territory. In Lebanon, they're very steep. In Lebanon, refugees have been traditionally, because of the developments there over the past decades, have been excluded from a range of fundamental rights that they should be granted, and that and the granting of these rights, as we have often said to the Lebanese authorities and to the refugees themselves, do not in any way diminish their fundamental entitlements as refugees, which has been a question in the past. I must say that the past three Lebanese governments, government of Prime Minister Signorov, Prime Minister Hariri, and Prime Minister Mikati, have been very forthcoming on this issue. And the Parliament last year voted some important legislative amendments to increase the range of rights of Palestinians to access some professions. This is a very small step, which, by the way, has not yet been implemented, needs to be implemented now that there is a government in place. And it is very important that it is implemented, because a lot of the assistance that is provided to refugees could be diminished if they could work, they could have access to profession and be more self-sustaining, while remaining refugees with all the rights that go with being refugees, and of course access to UNRWA services. This is an important debate, and I'm glad to say that we've got positive responses from the Lebanese establishment. Refugee question in Lebanon is very sensitive, as we all know, and has to be tackled with sensitivity accordingly, but it is, new spaces for discussion have opened up. And finally, of course, in Jordan and Syria have been traditionally the most stable places for Palestinian refugees to live. Now, of course, in the present climate in the Middle East, the situation is less stable in both countries than it was ever before. And in Syria, of course, unfortunately, because of the situation there, refugees have been caught on a number of occasions in the conflict. I tend to always stress, as I did the other day, that, and as I did this morning with the Syrian ambassador, that it is correct to say that refugees have not been targeted. That's not the issue. But unfortunately, they have found themselves, as many other Syrians, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that has been very bad because some of them have lost their lives. We have said it publicly, and we will continue to, of course, request that the government of Syria continues to extend the protection that it has extended for decades in a very exemplary manner to the refugees, even under these very trying circumstances. Jordan, as I said, continues to be stable. Of course, Jordan also is not exempt from the tensions in the region. It is laudable, I think, that the government, that His Majesty the King and the government are embarking on a series of reforms, including reforms that address some of the concerns of Palestinians, more in the electoral domain and in the legal domain, but by and large the situation continues to be quite stable there. The fundamental challenge, however, remains one, going back to my initial point. The fundamental challenge, and you may think that this could be a bit remote from the daily preoccupations of refugees. The fundamental challenge is that the refugees see themselves as part of a constituency, of a group, whose right to not to be refugees has not yet been addressed. So, in other words, a constituency for which, a refugee constituency for which a solution has not yet been found after more than 6 decades. And this frustration, which is very real, now finds itself in this big regional context, and finds itself confronted also with the statehood bid and all that it implies. Now, I have no doubt that many of you would like to know, would be interested in my views about the statehood, about what the statehood bid is. But I am sorry that from my humanitarian perspective, all I can tell you is what I think it isn't from the perspective of refugees. Certainly it is not, living as we do with the refugees on the ground, certainly the whole process is not going to change immediately, directly, the situation of people on the ground. The challenges that we have described, especially in the West Bank and in Gaza, very much limit even the state-building efforts that have been led by Prime Minister Fayyad. I'm not suggesting that there should be, or there should not be an institutional bid. This is really, this is not for me to say that. I can certainly endorse in a broader sense, the statement of the United Nations Secretary General that the aspiration of Palestinians to having a state is a very legitimate one, but I think that this is universally recognized. How to get there is really, as he said about himself, is really not for me to say. But certainly what I can say is that the situation, the reality on the ground is very far from the realization of the state. The obstacles that people have to face in their everyday life are very, very different from what they would face if they were in their own country. Now, more relevant perhaps from the refugee perspective, it is important to stress that the statehood question in itself does not address the refugee question. That's very important, because that whole issue has created tension and unrest among refugee communities, and it is important, and that I think is relevant to our mandate, to say that, to remind everybody that the refugee question has to be solved through negotiation in the political domain. And I think that this is a very important point to make. The refugee question is a political question and has to be is the responsibility of the parties to the conflict to solve. All I want to say here, because this is well known, is that it has to be solved in a spirit of justice. It has to be solved taking into due consideration United Nations resolutions regarding this matter. But can I say something perhaps a bit more unusual? We believe, and we've been saying it, that it can only be solved through consultation with the refugees themselves. Too often, the refugees are considered a final status issue, and not of group of people with their own aspirations, with their own wishes, with their own fears and concerns. And unless the refugees are involved in some way in this discussion, whenever it happens, the discussion is not happening right now, whatever solution is arrived at in the political domain, and we know that inevitably those solutions will be difficult. They will demand difficult compromises on the part of everybody. But unless there is a buy-in, a sense of ownership on the part of refugees, I think that that solution will not be durable. And I'm talking now far ahead of the reality around us, which is unfortunately not even close to that. But if we have a political peace that is not a peace of the people, including of the refugees, that peace has very slim chances to be durable, especially in a situation like that of the Middle East. You know, we've been saying, my predecessor and myself have been saying this for some years. And I have to tell you that in most cases before, we were met with very polite smiles, saying, here come the naive humanitarians, talk about involving the refugees in the discussion, but we know that the discussion will be in a closed room between political actors, and then a solution will be published and everybody will have to accept it. I think that in the present climate that we described in the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, when people feel that they have a right to express their aspirations, perhaps this proposal to involve the refugees is less outlandish and less naive than it seemed before. You remember the outcry when the so-called Palestinian papers were leaked, especially around the refugee issue. I think refugees by and large knew what was being discussed, but I think the outcry was in particular about the sense of having been excluded from that discussion. And this is actually true for many other refugee situations that I have been in my career, and I think that this one makes no exception. In the meantime, and I conclude, because unfortunately this moment of consultation will have to wait the moment when the issue is put back on the negotiating table, and the moment is not there yet. Meanwhile, I think, if I may make a pitch in support of the agency that I lead, it is important to continue to support UNRWA and those others that work to support Palestine refugees. It is important to support our humanitarian work, but it is important, I guess, and let me leave you with this last concluding point, to support, to understand and support our work through which we provide opportunities to refugees. Through our microfinance, through our education first and foremost, but also our microfinance program. We have now a wonderful program in Lebanon, in Syria, through which we engage young refugees. We're actually hoping to have a large event together with the European Union in the spring called Youth Works, in which we will showcase our work for young people, and we will make a strong case for that work to be supported. Because, of course, refugees need a solution to their plight, a just solution to their plight. Their rights have to be eventually fulfilled. Until that point, they will inevitably live in a precarious situation. But meanwhile, it is important to continue to give them opportunities, even in the temporary status in which they're in, because only through having access to these opportunities, they will be a constituency of peace, which I hope soon we will need in our efforts to have peace more broadly in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Filippo. we're going to go to the room for questions in a few minutes, but I have 2 or 3 I want to ask beforehand. I want to just tell you something. It reinforces what you just said. Terry Rode Larson, our president, who cannot be here today because he's in Finland, would like to be here because they are friends, and also Terry has been a very large figure, as you all know, in the Middle East for more than 2 decades. Because of Terya's importance and relevance to the Middle East, we at IPI often get visited by people on both sides of the argument. And I have in mind about 1.5 years ago, at a time when Palestinians and Israelis were not supposed to be speaking to each other, Saeb Erekat, then the chief negotiator for the Palestinians, and Dan Meridor, then the vice premier of Israel, came here. We had a private meeting, a dinner one night, and then we had a public meeting the next day, at which they both sat at this table and talked back and forth. I was at both, and frankly, what they said in public was pretty close to what they had said in private. And the argument came down, as it often does. I mean, it is commonly said, why can't we settle this thing? Because we know the parameters. Those parameters have been the same for 2 decades right now. You can go back to Madrid, Oslo peace process, more recently to Camp David or Annapolis, and everybody says, we know the outlines of the state and we know what should be done. But it comes down to one issue always, which is insoluble, and that is refugees. And Saeb Erekat and Dan Meridor arrived at that point, and I remember that was where it simply, there just simply didn't seem to be a solution, and it was the great block. And I say that simply to reinforce, Filippo, what you've just said, and frankly to sort of sympathize with you, because in my visits to Israel and to the West Bank and to Gaza, I've often been struck by the fact that working for UNRWA is really one of the most thankless things, because the Palestinians don't like you because they have a dependence upon you. And that's not your fault, that's just the function. And Israelis don't like you because they think you are partial to the Palestinians. I was struck by the fact that you said that on the statehood argument, that you said that obviously it will not solve the refugee problem. But I wanted to ask you 2 questions about that. Number one is, do refugees, I wanted to ask you a broad question about the effect of the statehood argument on Palestinians. And the specific question is, do refugees realize that the statehood argument does not really settle their problem, take care of them? And then the second part of that question was, were Palestine to become a state, does that put you out of business?
Yes. I think the replies are yes and no. Yes, because I think that there is an understanding, although there is anxiety. I think the refugees fundamentally, and this is more of a psychological notation on my part, feel suspicious of change that they don't fully understand. Now, the statehood discussion is a big change. Imagine, they also feel suspicious when we tell them, for example, that we should stop distributing food and we should start adopting more modern practice of assistance through cash. They get suspicious that there is a change. And I think that the reality is that change for them has been largely negative over the years, has always been for the worse. So of course they have developed an instinctive suspicion. And I think that that's what is happening around a process that is not entirely perhaps clear in its contours. And, you know, in my own meetings with Saeb Erekat or with other Palestinian leaders, I always tell them, look, it's not for me to, you know, I'm not in the business into judging this. This is not my job. I'm not a political actor here, but I can tell you that whatever you do, whatever is done in the context of this process, in the same spirit that I described earlier, please explain this very clearly to the refugees. It is important that they understand what is going on from your perspective. And on the second one, no, you know, I think that UNRWA is out of business only when the refugee question is over. Certainly, I hope that that date, you know, I always hope to be the last Commissioner General, but I think that most of my predecessors hope to be the last Commissioner General, and it hasn't happened yet. But certainly, it will be necessary. I guess that what will happen, I don't know, when a solution is found, depending on what the terms of the solution are, there will be a transition period, and UNRWA will have some specific responsibilities. UNRWA has a lot of assets, of course, in the region: schools, personnel, health centers, structures. That, you know, a decision will have to be made about all of this and how all of this will benefit the Palestinian state that will emerge from that solution, and in particular will benefit the refugees wherever they will be at that point. And we hope that it will be in a manner that reflects their aspirations and rights. But until that point, UNRWA will be necessary.
Filippo, on the funding thing you mentioned, even in good times, has UNRWA ever been fully funded? And the second part of that question is, to what extent does that hurt your mission? In other words, if you were funded only, say, up to 75% of what you're asking for, does that result physically in specific services which you cannot render?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately the history of UNRWA is a history of difficult funding, difficult resource mobilizations. I mean, I've been with UNRWA only for the past 6 years, but I understand that the financial crisis have been affecting the agency for a long time, for many times in the long time in which it has been in existence. And at times it has been quite destructive. You know, my observation is that we've always managed, at least in these past few years, I can speak more with more knowledge about that, we've been able to maintain the level of services. What we have not been able to do is to maintain the quality always of those services. Because unfortunately, when you talk about education, when you talk about health, if you don't invest, the quality very quickly declines. UNRWA in the 60s and 70s ran education services that were probably the best in the region. And that's why there is, that's partly why Palestinian people are among the best educated. It's not just UNRWA, of course, because we only provide up to a certain level, and it is first and foremost witness to the qualities of the Palestinian people. But we have played a role in that through the good education that we have given in our schools. Now, we've been struggling. A few years back, we conducted tests with our students in Gaza with new methodologies. And it was very clear that through more accurate testing, the quality of education had declined, that there were kids, even not the youngest kids, but kids in the middle of the of the cycle that had difficulties reading or in mathematics. Now, we're addressing that through a very comprehensive reform, but this costs money, and this is where we struggle most, because with all the competition of so many crises around the world, it's very difficult to tell donors, please give us money for a crisis that has been there for 60 plus years. My answer to that is, unfortunately, that cost is the cost of political failure. It's not a cost that we are artificially inflating. It is a cost that will continue to be there and will continue to grow until there is a solution.
And finally, just back to your central point about the Arab Spring, is it possible to characterize how that is playing out in the territories, or indeed in the camps, which are in places like Jordan or Lebanon? Do Palestinians recognize those situations as situations that are very different than their own? A population which has seized the right to be heard and has gone into the streets, do they look at that and think that could never happen here? Do they look at that and do they think that's the answer for us?
I think they recognize, Palestinians have a very sophisticated analysis of the environment in which they live. Like every people that has, I've seen this in Afghanistan, as every people that has gone through a lot of suffering in its history, they develop incredible political instincts. And I think that their analysis is very subtle, and they fully appreciate that their situation is very different from people that are calling for their rights in fully fledged states. So I think that distinction is very clear to them. Now, I think that the way the Arab Spring so-called plays out in the Palestinian context is more, as I said, that it has created a space for people to be more vocal, and refugees will be vocal about their own aspirations and rights. Now, it's very interesting, I think that you all know, and let me stray away a little bit from my domain here, but just as an anecdote which I think is significant, that the first demand that occurred after the Egypt events, which really were the ones that impacted the most because of the proximity, the significance. The first demand was for, and I have some Palestinian friends that here will remember that, was for reconciliation of their leadership. And that's the first thing that Palestinians ask for in the aftermath of the Tahrir events. And I think it's very significant because, again, this is not my mandate and my domain, but this is a very strong demand of all Palestinians, including refugees. And I think it is a demand that is understood by the leadership, is also understood by Hamas. Of course, it has been a complex discussion. I do hope that it will progress in a positive way towards peace, rather than the opposite. But it is an important one. But then after that, other demands were made. But I think they recognize their different circumstances, but they take advantage of that space just like other people in other countries.
I thought one more question as you were answering that one, and that was a specific one about social media. And you talk about the sophistication of the Palestinians, people like that who have learned to read their situation pretty clearly. What has the impact, or has the impact of social media among the Palestinians been as dramatic as we have seen it in the Arab Spring? Are they really in connection with each other? Do they find out, is good reporting that they would understand and not think was somehow Western biased, is that available to them? Do they take advantage of it?
Absolutely. You know, I have to tell you that, of course, the management of UNRWA is in constant dialogue with the staff, the very large staff that we have to deal with, and its representatives. They're always ahead of the management because they use the media much better than the management, and they communicate with each other between Lebanon and Gaza, even across these very complicated borders. I think that, you know, besides the UNRWA anecdote, the use of social media has been important. Remember, Palestinians, the ones we work with, from, you know, north of Syria to the south of Jordan, from Lebanon to Gaza, live in one of the regions, if you think about it, with the most complicated border situations in the entire world. So borders are a very important obstacle to their physical movement, to their ability also to be together, Palestinians with Palestinians. That's why I think they have, you know, like especially the young people, like every youth in the world, they're very adept, they're very skillful in using social media, but they are even more so because it is almost a necessity of life to resort to media that can go across borders, and while they cannot travel, they cannot get visas, they cannot get permissions, especially in Gaza, but also in other places.
Excellent. I'd love to get some questions and comments. If you would just raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and we'll take about 2 or 3 at once. By the way, just to reiterate what Marianne told you at the outset, we are webcasting this, so please hold the microphone very close to your mouth. Please introduce yourself at the very beginning, and if you would stand up, that's great. It makes it easier for the cameraman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I wish to thank Filippo. Thanks for IPI for organizing this event, and thanks for Filippo for the introduction that he gave. I just wanted to allude, being a Palestinian refugee myself and representing the Palestinian people also at the UN. I wanted to refer to two issues that Filippo raised in his statement. The first one is basically with regard to inclusion of the refugees. And as you are well aware that we don't differentiate at the discourse of the internal Palestinian discourse between a refugee and a non-refugee. And we have our own president who is a refugee himself. So the representation and the representation is a bit complicated because maybe part of it is of the geographical nature of the spread of the refugees. But then if they are involved or not involved, I mean, that would be relative in a way or another. But we're talking here about the general population of the refugees. That would be a correct characterization that Filippo gave about that. And in the build-up to the UN and the statehood issue, I was myself involved in meeting the refugees in the refugee camps of Balata and Kalandia and everywhere else. And I saw how, just like you explained it, how worried they were about the whole thing and how it would affect their right to return, not in the bid itself, in bringing statehood, which is an aspiration for all Palestinian people, as you are also well aware. My second point is basically related to the, I mean, we're talking in the context of Arab Spring. And I believe the Palestinian refugees have been in their own, if you wish, winter for over 64 years now. And they tried time and again to express to the whole world that they wish their aspirations, just like the international community has granted them, to be legitimately given to them. And yet nobody is heeding these calls, contrary to what we saw all around us and all around the world for that matter. Don't you think that this is the main problem in the way the world and at best you know, the effective nations are dealing with the issue itself? Because I mean, Kalandia is on daily spring, if you wish, daily conflict with the occupation on daily basis in Kalandia. We had the last large waves that came from Syria and Lebanon marched, and they were shot at the same time they were condemned for their own death by even quarters in this at the UN. So don't you think that this is the main problem with the Palestinian refugees issue? Thank you.
I think I'll let you answer that now, and we'll...
One at a time.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, any Palestinian can speak about Palestinians much more eloquently and with more knowledge than I do. I want to defer. I'm only here to support and help and interpret in a way. My message on inclusion of refugees is perhaps premature, because you know we're very far now from, unfortunately, let's hope not, but I fear from the type of discussion in which they should be involved concerning a solution to their plight. But of course, it's a message that I have discussed it with President Abbas more than once, and he always tells me that the communication is exercised with refugees. I'll continue to say this. I think it's my duty, if I were working with any governments having a refugee question to solve. I've done it in the past. You know, I worked for UNHCR many years, and that was always an important task that we had, to remind governments to communicate with their refugees abroad, especially when the time had come for solutions to be exercised. So I'll continue to remind my Palestinian interlocutors of the importance of preparing refugees for peace, which may be tough, which may have some tough aspects in the future, and I think it's important to do that. By the way, you know, you are quite right to say that one of the difficulties there is this spread and these obstacles that we have described. But, you know, social media are there for that as well, and I think they could be used even more effectively to communicate some of those messages. And on your second one, yeah, sure. Of course, you know, my entire gist of what I was trying to say is frustration, because refugees, and perhaps Palestinians at large, but in my case, refugees in particular, feel left behind in a situation which is much more dynamic in other places where, you know, rights are being addressed, or at least begin to be addressed, and where other aspirations are being expressed and meet some sympathy and support on the part of the international community. And this sense of being left behind, of being forgotten, as is the title of this event, is not good. It's not good for the people, first of all, but I think it's not good also for stability, for peace, for security, because a forgotten, a marginalized constituency, especially a large one, which carries so much baggage, is not good for stability in a region which is so volatile. So in many, many ways, it is important to address that deficit of international attention to come to a solution. But the solution there is peace, of course, is the resumption of negotiation, is successful negotiations, and is finding solution for all the different questions of this incredibly complicated political problem.
I think I saw a hand here, and others I know on the right here. Is there a third? Because we can do, oh, fine. Let's do 1, 2, 3 all at once, and then we'll answer them. Please.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Many questions to be answered. Your department, you mentioned you have a large staff. Are this staff Palestinian people or all sort of other nationalities? That is number one. Number two, you mentioned about inclusion and equal participation, which is very timely, and many other activities of the human family are looking at that. How involved are women in this decision making? And also, when you say including the refugees and you have camps or I don't know, communities in different countries, is there a governance, or how are you going to decide from which camp how many people are going to be selected to be involved on the table of decision making? These are questions that they come to my mind. Also, from the neighboring countries, are you getting any help? The reason I'm asking this question, my native country is Iran, and I want to know if they are involved in any assisting with health and education particularly. Thank you.
Could I just add one thing to that question, specifically Gulf states, because I think there's been a little change there. Jeff Laurenti.
Jeff Laurenti, the Century Foundation. Filippo, you had started the discussion by expressing the hope, maybe fantasy, that you'd be the last Commissioner General. So let us fantasize for a moment, or hope, or assume that 15 months from now, new political majority comes to power in Israel that's willing to pick up on where they've already negotiated. You get a deal. Presumably some trickle of refugees allowed slowly back to within the borders of Israel. The rest to be compensated, relocated perhaps to what remains of now Arab Palestine. How quickly do you fold out, close out your existing operations in those settlements, thinking of Syria and Lebanon in particular, maybe Jordan, and within West Bank and Gaza, will the most of the population basically just continue living where they are? So what is the phase out for your enterprise with a peace settlement?
And then finally, gentlemen here in that front row by the door.
Hi, Thomas Othep, UN Alliance of Civilizations. I'm going to ask you a very practical question, which you raised at the beginning, talking about funding. And I guess I'm less optimistic than you. I want to ask you, what are the current sources of funding in terms of countries? And does this Arab Spring then lead to opportunities for fundraising from those countries that have become more democratic, more representative? And is that something that is potential?
All right, if you could just answer those in order.
I'll try to regroup. These are good questions. First of all, a very practical one. Our staff are near 30,000. They're Palestinians because they are teachers and doctors. They work in the community. They have to be part of the community. That's the only way. We have a very thin layer of management staff, most of whom are international officials, just like any other UN agency. But I think that our current number of approved posts is 133. So that's very small compared to the 30,000. We have a bit more, short-term staff. But I don't think we have more than 200 international staff and 30,000 Palestinian staff. So really the bulk is local people. In terms of funding, our funding is overwhelmingly from voluntary sources. So governments give us funding on a voluntary basis. We receive a small amount of money every year from the UN budget, from the assessed contributions. We have a very small share. This is for these international posts. This is part of a General Assembly arrangement. But the rest, 98% of our funding is voluntary. And that's why it's so difficult, because every year we have to start again fundraising. That's actually perhaps my main job, is to go around the world and raise funds for the agency, which is, it's an agency that costs $1 billion a year. If you take everything together, our regular program, our projects, and it's a tough order. It's a tall order in the present economic climate in the world. We do, to answer also some of the other questions, we do receive funding from, we can receive funding from any member state of the United Nations, of course, although the vast majority of our funding comes from a rather small group of traditional donors, from Europe, from North America, Australia, Japan. Increasingly, we are receiving funds from Arab and Gulf states, although it's not so much for core work, but for special project. But for example, the reconstruction program in Gaza is almost entirely funded by Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Development Bank, Kuwait, and some other Arab countries. And we have invested a lot in the past 2 years to try to promote more funding from these other sources. We are now actually making an extra effort to get funds from emerging economies. And we've made a little progress with Brazil, India, Turkey, and some other countries. This is quite a complex exercise. So, but we are a United Nations agency, so, like other similar agencies, we depend on government funding. Solutions and how, now, I don't want to speculate what the solution will be. This is not up to me to say. There are as you know, one of the difficulties of this whole question is that the demand of the refugees, the right of return, is that they go back to their homes. Their homes is what is now the State of Israel. And the Israeli government, the State of Israel rejects completely. And it is this big conflict that makes it so difficult. It's an existential question for both sides. And this is what makes it so dramatically difficult. And this is for the parties to find a solution to. Tall order, very difficult one. Once this is achieved, one way or the other, once this is achieved, and we hope that it will be according to justice, I want to say this all the time, UNRWA will be given a task on how to fold its operations. Now, many solutions have been envisaged and designed. I always say this is the conflict that has a library of solutions. You just have to have the political will to go to the shelf and pick the one that is going to be adopted. That's what is missing. But it will take a few years probably to fold, because it's a complex operation. But it's difficult to tell. Some people, like to speak about a 5-year transition. But I have no idea, really. I think that we need to see what the solution will be, and then on the basis of that, we will very quickly. We know what our assets are. We know what we can hand over, and that will be actually not the most difficult part of the whole operation, I think. And finally, I think you asked the most important question, because it's easy for me to say refugees have to be included, but how to include them is a very difficult one. And it's not just the distance, but I've been in other refugee situations where in the good situation, the moment comes when you have to include them in the discussion. And it's always difficult. Who represents the refugees? You start from that fundamentally difficult point. The refugees are, in the refugee camps where only about 1/3 of the refugees live, by the way, there are committees. Are these committee representative of all the refugees? I'm not sure. Not everywhere, anyway. So are they the ones who should speak on behalf of the refugees? I think that we need to be creative, or not we, because this is not really an UNRWA task. This is a task for the Palestinians. The Palestinians will have to be creative. And they are already, as was said before, they're already starting thinking about that and doing it. But they will have to be creative in devising ways to access the broadest possible number of people in terms of information and consultation. And like I said, the modern technology can be of great help there. And by the way, of course, women will have to have an equal role there. All we can do from our side is to try to promote their rights and to empower them through the projects that we do within our mandate. And we have, even in Gaza, where it is very difficult, we have very successful gender-based program for the promotion of the rights of women, for increasing their economic self-reliance, their specific education and skills. And I think that this is our contribution to making them eventually able to participate in that debate.
Okay, Ann Phillips, and then Angela. 1, 2, 3. Good. We'll take all three at once again.
Oh, thank you. Hello. As you know, you and I met at another forum where you were discussing this UNRWA and the Palestinian situation. Now, I know you will correct me if I'm wrong, and perhaps I am, but I remember you saying, and I was stunned by this fact, that 25% of your budget came from America. Is that correct?
A little less, yeah, 22. Yeah.
22. And 2% come from the Arab world. To what do you attribute this enormous imbalance? I mean, I was really quite stunned at that information. I'm interested to know why why it exists that way.
Angela Merkel.
Thank you very much, Angela Kane from the United Nations. I was earlier this week at an event which actually had really nothing to do with Palestinian refugees, but it was about Journalism Award. But the keynote speaker was Queen Noor of Jordan, and she gave in her keynote address, that's exactly what she focused on, Palestinian refugees. And I thought it was striking because it also brought home the fact there isn't a lot of information. I mean, I think that the figure you cited of 4.5 million Palestinian refugees is largely unknown, except to a small number of people who follow that subject. And my question is really, isn't there more that can be done to enhance the advocacy? I mean, you talked about, you have advocacy in terms of raising funds, but I think that there's a lack of information that's out there. And I've also been struck by the fact that we do have a program in the United Nations about the Division for Palestinian Rights, which does include it, but also not as one of their main constituencies, so to say. And I think something could also be done to put a spotlight a little bit more on that issue. Thank you.
Okay, and our third question is right here.
Would you say that
would you identify yourself, please?
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm Sarah. I'm with CNN. And my question is about whether these communities are self-sufficient. Having visited Sabra and Shatila in 2005, it seemed that those camps were their own communities outside of Beirut. So is there a sentiment within the refugees of having their own governing system or programs within the refugee camps that are completely outside the realm of the governance of the countries that they are in?
Okay, on the question, Anne's question on funding, there is a big, there is a big problem there, or a big issue that we are trying to address. In fact, it's not just the 20 or 22% U.S. funding. If you add up European funding and U.S. funding, basically you reach very quickly 80%. And so our funding base is very narrow. Frankly, as is the case for most other so-called humanitarian agencies, is very narrow. And we've been trying, our traditional donors, so to speak, have been very vocal on this. They think that the burden should be shared more widely. And they have also certainly looked at the Arab world. After all, this is, in their region, it is a cause that is strongly felt, and I think that it is important that they also contribute. But like I said in my introduction, I think or in one of my answers, I think we are making progress there. We've invested a lot. We've created a unit in the agency that deals with this particular aspect of resource mobilization. And I personally have invested a lot of time and energy in establishing dialogue. Now, there are some political questions underlying that. In the especially early decades of UNRWA's existence, in many countries in the region thought that this was a problem that had not been caused by them, and therefore the financial burden deriving from the refugee question should not be borne by people by countries and people in the region. Now, I think that this view is receding, and that there is a general sense that it is important, first and foremost, for the welfare of the people themselves, but also for the stability of a region that is so volatile, that refugees are supported. And this year, I'm pleased to say, Saudi Arabia is our third largest donor in 2011. Like I said, it's still very much targeted, but this is also has to do with the type of aid structure in those countries. And it is very much targeted to certain special projects and certain activities, but we're making a lot of progress. Through the dialogue that we have established, I think that we are enlarging the possibilities. And I'm fairly optimistic that we can diminish the burden a bit on the traditional donors, although they will continue to bear the bulk of the brunt, and increase the contribution of others, especially those in the region. Angela, I can only agree with you. I think that it is partly, to be frank, and it's not an excuse really, because of our very limited resources that we cannot be as, we don't have a very big public information apparatus. Because when we get resources, we tend to invest them all in our programs that are so demanding in terms of resources. But I entirely agree with you that sometimes investing in information pays off in other ways, and we are looking at collaborating even more greatly with other parts of the UN system to try to gain traction there. And your point is very well taken. And finally, this very important question of self-reliance, and it varies very much from country to country. In Jordan and Syria, the situation in Syria is a bit complicated now, but traditionally in Jordan and Syria, where refugees have had access to a wide range of rights, of freedoms, their economic situation, their self-reliance, as you put it, has been much greater. And this has been much less problematic than in other places. It has been, of the host countries outside Palestine, it is in Lebanon really where the problems have been the most acute. In Lebanon, there is a very complicated historical baggage because of the civil war, because of the fact that many refugees were caught in the civil war one way or the other. The inheritance is heavy and difficult. And there are communities still now in Lebanon that are hostile to the refugees. And for governments that are based on such fragile political agreements, extreme caution has to be exercised when dealing with delicate political issues such as those of the Palestinians. And this, unfortunately, has had a cost for the people. We have always made it very clear. Like I said, I think that there's some breakthrough. And I think that increasingly governments have understood that they cannot have a marginalized community out there, precisely for the same reason that we have mentioned so many times this afternoon, that marginalized communities are not good. It's a bad thing in itself, but they're also not good for the stability, especially of very fragile context like in Lebanon. So, but it's going far too slowly, and we are really trying to accelerate this enlargement of rights, especially in the realm of work, and later on there will be other issues, but work has to be the first one. People have to be able to access a wider range of professions legally so that they can be more self-reliant and less dependent on international assistance.
Very good. In the second row here.
Good afternoon. I'm Colonel Manoj Tiwari. I'm the Indian Military Advisor. I just have a question concerning the peacekeepers. There is a substantial presence of peacekeepers in the region. Are they in any way helping your cause? And if not, do you think they can? And if the same can be integrated into the mandates that are being given to them? Do you think there is some scope for the peacekeepers to help your organizations?
just go ahead and answer that.
I heard the General Mood briefed you here once, so you must have...
Yes, no, General Mood was here in January, actually. Man, he was the first SRS or SRSG equivalent to come here.
Yeah, no, you know, there are, yes, it's fascinating to look at the peacekeepers in the Middle East because they reflect such a long and diverse history and different phases of attempts at peace or at least at ceasefires. But their mandate is very specific and is very much of a mandate to, by and large, is to observe or to report and to keep the peace, essentially, or make sure that the peace is kept through, you know, the usual tools that peacekeeping operations have. They are not directly involved in our operations. So, in as much as they contribute to peace, or at least they contribute to avoiding conflict, of course, they are useful to us, but in a very indirect way and broad way. I don't think they would have the resources, and it's not the nature of these peacekeeping operations to have that dimension that they have in other places, for sure.
In that connection, one of the founders of IPI, which was then known as IPA, the International Peace Academy, it was a training academy for peacekeepers, was an Indian general named Indarjit Ricky, who was an original peacekeeper from the 1948 force in Sinai. So there you are. Do I see any other questions, any other hands? That's okay. You always ask good questions. You can ask a second one.
Thank you. I know it is not your mandate, but I'm dying to know your comments on UNESCO's admission of Palestine as a state. I apologize for the question, but I really want to know. Thank you.
I was going to say that I may have to let you die, but perhaps not to conclude so dramatically. No, what can I say? I will not make comments because, as I said, really, I don't think it belongs to me to make comments on the ways these legitimate aspirations are pursued. They're very complicated politically, as we know, and it would be totally inappropriate for me to make comments in this respect. I can only say that I hope that a solution is found, leaving aside for a minute the statehood part, but for the sake of UNESCO and the incredibly important and good work that UNESCO does, not least for the Palestinian refugees, if I may say. You know, UNESCO has a partnership with UNRWA, has had it for, I think, well over 50 years. Our director of education is a staff of UNESCO. And UNESCO is deeply involved in many of the programs that we do. And this is only one of the many, many other important things that they do, and it is important that they continue to be supported. And I hope that, I know the situation is I was in Washington yesterday. Situation is very difficult and very complicated, but I do hope that efforts being currently made to try to address that situations are successful for the sake of the education in the world.
And Phillips also has a second question, and then Josh Smilovitz after her.
Okay, thank you very much. I, at one time, served on the board of Save the Children, and we opened up a project in Gaza, which I went to visit. We changed our philosophy from giving humanitarian assistance, food, cash, and so forth, to development. We let the community determine what their needs were. We sent in people to help train them and to develop so that they could fulfill their needs by themselves, instead of just being dependent constantly. Has your board ever discussed that possibility of that type of aid to the Palestinians, helping them develop on their own so that they could, you know, it's become a cliche now about teaching a person how to fish so they could feed their belly for the rest of their life?
Just pass the microphone to Josh.
Joshua Smilovitz. I'm curious, as an educational organization, self-described, how does your curriculum deal with the negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians, specifically looking post-Oslo?
Why don't you ask both? Yep, please.
Well, don't forget that actually like I said in my introduction, you know, the perception that we are a humanitarian organization based on handouts is actually wrong, because remember, we teach education in schools. That's actually teaching people how to fish. Our handout, the handout part of our work is a very small percentage, and it's essentially in conflict situation or when conflicts are not completely resolved, like in Gaza because of the blockade and other circumstances. But that's only, actually it's a secondary part of our work. I always say that, God forbid, but should really many of our resources disappear, I would want education to be kept. That's the last one that I would like to see go, because it is so important for the reasons that, so in a way we are all, actually, you know, when the Millennium Development Goals were developed and discussed and presented and finalized, this, you know, really incredibly clever way of projecting development in the 21st century, we said, well, you know, many of those goals we have pursued for more than 60 years. In terms of, you know, gender parity in UNRWA schools was achieved, I think, in the 50s, which is quite remarkable. And in a region where, you know, gender parity in schools was achieved much later, if it was achieved. So, you know, we have been doing this type of development work long before many others. Of course, you know, there's always a lot of room to improve. And now, for example, no, but you give me the opportunity to explain this. You know, in one of our key programs, which we call Relief and Social Services, which is an old label for what we do in terms of trying to alleviate poverty, I think that many of our approaches are old-fashioned. And there is where we are trying to improve and reform based on best practices of NGOs, of other United Nations agencies, and so forth. So really, we are always striving to work, and I'm glad you asked this question because I think it's important to clarify. And on the curriculum, this is always a very difficult one. You know, many decades ago, an arrangement was established, brokered by UNESCO, in fact, whereby our schools adopted the curriculum of the countries in which we operate. So in Jordan, for example, we have the Jordanian curriculum. In Palestine, in Gaza and the West Bank, we have the Palestinian curriculum, which was developed after Oslo. And, well, you know, the curriculum is a curriculum for children. Remember, we only teach up to the 9th grade, and in Jordan to the 10th grade. Only in Lebanon, we teach beyond because there's no access, once again, to schools. But, you know, we teach essentially children. So the curriculum is fairly simple. We have added, about 10 years ago, we developed with American support, we developed a human rights curriculum with the permission of the host countries, which is what we call an enrichment to the regular curriculum. This is not taught in state schools in those countries. And it addresses issues of human rights, conflict resolution, and tolerance. And we're actually doing further work at the moment to further improve, and Norway is helping us at the moment, to further improve the quality of this human rights curriculum. It's very complex because many issues, even put in a simple way, or even more so when put in a simple way for children, are so delicate and sensitive in a region with so many tensions that we have to be very careful. We work very much with the communities. We work with local experts, with local educationists, with our own teachers, with education specialists from the host countries, with international specialists, with UNESCO support. And it's a complex exercise, and we have embarked in a new phase of this curriculum improvement, which I hope will give very good results in the years to come.
Filippo, we've got 5 more minutes, and I want to give you the final word. And let me set it up with the following observation. In January, you will have been Commissioner General for 2 years. For the 5 years prior to that, you were the Deputy Commissioner General. So you've been intensely involved in this process for 7 straight years. You also said today that, like all your predecessors, you would like to be the last Commissioner General. So my question is, after those 7 years, do you have more reason or less reason to believe that final day will come sooner?
That's the most difficult question that you're asking me.
That's why we saved it to the last.
I don't know. You know, I think that I have, if I can make a personal comment here, I have a better understanding of the complexity of the situation than I had when I joined UNRWA back in 2005. And unfortunately, as you gain a deeper understanding of the complexities on all sides, you realize how difficult solutions are. We mentioned the refugee question, the one that is so central to the existence of my agency and that alone. But, you know, what about Jerusalem? That goes deep into the conscience, the history, the mind of the people in the region and beyond, in fact. So, you know, these are all immensely difficult questions, and they will require so much courage to be addressed and resolved, and to bring all the people behind those solutions. The awareness of this complexity has grown and has made me realize that it will take a long time and a lot of difficult efforts. But I think that it has not diminished, at least for me personally, but I can say this for many people that have worked there for many years, and I know that some are here with us today, and I don't think it has diminished my resolve. If anything, it has made me more convinced that it will require commitment, it will require dedication and a lot of hard work. So that's my and my colleagues' contribution. We are not there to find the solutions. That's not our task. This is the task of the parties to the conflict. That's the way this conflict resolution process has been structured. I think our task is to try to build around that process conditions that are as conducive as possible to peace. And that, I think, is an effort which is possible. So, you know, I have worked with refugees for most of my United Nations career, which is getting close to 24 years. And I don't think I would continue to work if I didn't think that solutions were possible.
Filippo, I know I speak for the entire room when I say, first of all, we wish you well in that very important work, very difficult work. And also, we thank you very much for coming and giving us this very candid assessment.